Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Hello, dear friends. Assalamu alaikum and very good evening. I welcome you all to the 10th session of the Discourse of History. On the rebus demand of our foreign audience who were attending us from abroad, we are changing the pattern of our program today. One, we are changing the pattern of the program from Urdu to English. I hope you all will like it. Due to certain technical problems, we were unable to take your questions properly. So we have also changed our media to have you on board with your live questions, which will be running on the screen in the borderline. Thirdly, this time our program will be available on both the media of Facebook and YouTube simultaneously. And so you can watch us on any of the media of your own choice. Next, my friends, our real intent is to provide you the best possible content. That is why all our previous programs are available on our Facebook and YouTube channel. You are requested to prescribe our channel and click the bell icon so that you may have all our videos and programs automatically. Finally, dear friends, that all the real strength of this program is the presence of our valuable historian, Dr. ASLAM SYED, who joins us every week from Germany. We are really obliged, sir, that you are here with us. Sir Syed, from now onwards, I will be kicking off this program with a question or a set of questions which you will be replying and you will be addressing. And the questions which are raised by the audience, we will be taking all those questions subsequently. And in this way, this program will be moving ahead. Since we are going to kick around the vintage of medieval Muslim history and historiography, it is quite a wide and valuable and extensive subject. So we will try to cover it in a number of sessions, uh, maybe two or three or four. So, sir, I think today we should focus on only the Umayyad history and historiography. And in the next session, we will be covering the Abbasids, the Fatimids, the Ottomans, and so on and so forth. So, sir, I start this discourse with a simple yet a fundamental question about the concept of medievalism, medievality, medievalists. I mean, what basically is the genesis of this term, sir? And what is basically the relevance of this term and how is it conceived and perceived by the West and the East? So, over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Saab. I'll simply say that, this medieval term was used by those people who call themselves the beginners of modern era history. Medieval had some features which they describe. One was they felt that religion really determined the contours of history and politics. Secondly, mostly these were agrarian societies, and this idea of cities coming into existence was gradually coming. And thirdly, we didn't have any what we call today a middle class. We didn't have any intervention between the autocratic rulers, whether they were kings or other oligarchies, and the subjects and the people. So these are some of the features that are normally associated with medievalism or medieval history. But in my view, it is, I'll just take you back to those times and ask those people who were writing about it or who were living it, what would they call it? They will call it, this is our contemporary history, this is our modern history, and maybe the history that we call ancient today would be called by them medieval, if at all they knew this terminology. So this is basically those eras in history where these so-called rational scientific discoveries, a way of thinking which was done later on by human beings, had either not initiated or they were perceived to be suppressed by uh, religious superstitions and those things. So even today, when we are addressing a gathering and somebody asks a questions or give a comment, are usually references that, oh, you live in medieval times. I mean, you are talking a language of medieval days. So we use it now as a pejorative term. We don't use it as a good term in modern days when we talk about medieval history or medieval times. So, to answer your question again and briefly, there is no such thing in history, if we look at it, as medieval history. Yeah, medieval ideas, ancient ideas, and some of those ancient ideas we later on dig into and they become so modern that we say that these ideas that were given to us by people who lived long, long ago are as contemporary as they were then. And I think it was an Italian, Vico, who said that no history is ancient or medieval, all history is contemporary. You see, the fact that we live and we talk about it and we look back and connect it with the present, that eradicates the distance between those people and us. Now, today, when we are talking about Umayyad period, yes, chronologically you could place it in medieval times, but if we look at the impact of those times in today's world, it will appear to be as contemporary as it was at that time. So I have a difference of opinion about those people who divide history into these different categories or time slots. I think it's, again, I would say it's for our convenience that we divide them so that we know where to end our discourse on earlier period and where to start our discourse on modern or post-modern or contemporary. Yes, your next question.
Sir,
Yeah.
thank you very much, sir, for your very comprehensive reply. Actually, I want to know, sir, how do you see the medieval Muslim historians and tradition of historiography during this phase?
Well, this period that we are talking about, Umayyad
Am I
period,
audible, sir?
yes, absolutely you are. Actually, this was not a period
Sir,
of history writing in that sense. We had reports. I don't know whether there was any restriction in publishing the books or whatever the reason was. We see the writing of history starting in early Abbasid period and then it continues. That was the time when we had the Hadith writing also, tafsir writing, so many other things, even codification of Muslim law that later on became what is known today as Islamic law, books on different aspects of religion, even books on the biography of the Prophet. These were all written later on after this period. We do have sources of history during this period. Now, I just wanted to say one thing that normally in our history books or historiography starts Umayyad period with the year 661 and takes it up to 750 AD. This is a slight mistake, not slight, I would say a lot, because after the death of the Holy Prophet, we see Syria is controlled by the Umayyads. First was his son, Abu Sufyan's son, Yazid. He was made the commander and governor of Damascus. After his death, His brother Muawiyah bin Abi Sufyan was appointed, and then he stayed on until his death in 661. So these 89 years, from 661 to 750, if we add these 29 or 30 years, it becomes almost 119 years of their rule. And this should be understood in the background of the fact that Umayyads had very good relations, commercial relations, and in some aspects, matrimonial relations with various tribes. And the most important of these tribes was Banu Kalb, a Christian tribe. And they made such a strong alliance with this tribe, that later on, even during Umayyad rule on all over the Muslim world, they played a very important role both in the armed forces of the Umayyads, the administration, and the other areas of their rule. So we have to keep this in mind, that Umayyads did not come into power after Khulafai Rashidin in that sense in which we look at it, but they had made their stronghold already in Syria just after the demise of the Holy Prophet. This, I thought, needs to be clarified, and it's absent from our historiography and most of our history books. They begin the history of Umayyad rule either with the coming of Sufyanids into power in Syria after Khulafai Rashidin, or after the martyrdom of Ali ibn Abi Talib. Then they begin that this is the beginning of Umayyad period. It started much earlier, and they did many other innovations. If you want to talk about, we can do. One of the most important innovation was that unlike the earlier caliphs, who used to call themselves Khalifatul Rasulullah, that, vicegerents of the Prophet, representatives of the Prophet, these people called themselves Khalifatullah. They considered themselves direct representatives of God. And I think on the fashion of, or on the pattern of Romans, who had the similar ideas, and which actually later on in the European history we would call as the divine rights of kings. So for the first time, we see amongst Umayyads holding on to this idea that rulers are appointed by God. Second thing which we see very visibly is the fact that Islam, from universal faith, is narrowed down during this period to Arab nationalism. Whosoever becomes predominant holds the reign to this religion and is considered to be the chosen representative of God. So much so that even those people, non-Arabs, who converted to Islam, they were still treated as zimmis, as those people who had to pay jizya, that poll tax that only non-Muslims used to pay. And during that short time of Umar bin Abdul Aziz, when he stopped this, he was asked by many of his governors that it will decrease the revenue of the government of the state. So he responded that I am not here as a revenue collector. I am here as someone who is looking after Muslim Ummah and the welfare of those people who are coming to the fold of this new religion. So we have to be very clear about certain things. And there are many other elements that we can talk about. I have only touched two things. One, the idea of a ruler. The idea of a ruler was no longer that he represents the Prophet of Islam, but he represents directly God. Secondly, and that's important, many people don't know perhaps that for a long time, the working language in revenue collection and in other things was not Arabic in most of these areas. Those areas where Persian was spoken in divans, as the departments were called at that time, Persian was used as the language. Similarly, in Egypt, Coptic language was used, and in Syria and other areas, Byzantine or Aramaic or Latin, whatever was prevalent at that time, that language was used. And that meant also that those people who belonged to these different faiths, they were also retained as officers, both in the administration and in the army. And sometimes they were given even very important portfolios like finance, like looking after the household of rulers, like advisors. So we have a long list of these people. And I think if you look at the history of Syria, written by Philip Hitti, he has given a very good account of how much of the old heritage of these areas was incorporated into what now we know as Muslim Ummah. Last thing before I answer your next question, I have to point this out, and that is about physical features of the Muslim world. Certain archaeological sites, which normally our historians don't pay any attention, we only look at the written material, we don't study what went into the archaeology. For example, if you look at the dome on the rock, that design, there are no minarets. How did that design come into existence? Who were the masons? Who were the decorators? Palace of Hisham near Nablus in Palestine, how was that decorated? How big that was? And later on, we will come to know that in Islam, we don't have floral, we don't have human figures or other designs, but that did not stop these people from incorporating human designs, animals' designs on their decorative patterns. So much so that even coins, at first they used the Sassanid and Byzantine coins. Later on, when they had the first mint, even then human figure was put on the coin with somewhere in the back written the first or the second article of the faith of Muslims. So these things that we call as coming into contact with another culture, a culture that was much more developed than the Arab nomadic culture, did influence both the institutions and thinking of the Muslim community that lived in those times. And we have to keep in mind this thing also, that taxation system, which later on will become a part of Islamic jurisprudence, also underwent changes. New ways of income were explored. And that will show the difference between these 4 or 5 schools of jurisprudence. Agricultural, vast agricultural lands, fishing, those things that people do in mining and other areas, since they were absent in the peninsula, Arabian Peninsula, when people realized that this is also source of income and it should also be taxed, or people should pay zakat or other taxes on that. For that, they didn't have any trained officers amongst the Arabs. So naturally, they had to retain people of these areas or even bureaucrats of those governments that they had defeated or they had replaced. These are some of the main features that, if you look at our textbooks that we teach to our students, are either not fully explained or analyzed, or they are mentioned only in passing.
Yes, thank you very much, sir. As you told, that Muslim rule by the time had expanded to the non-Arab world also. So we would like to know that was there any difference between the Arab historians and non-Arab historians? What was the nature of that difference? And I will switch these questions with the question of Dr. Tanvi.
Hmm.
She is a historian. She has a wonderful sense in the writing of history in and after 10th century
Yeah.
AD. So,
Yes, she has used Foucault's sense, this French, what you call him, sociologist basically he was, but he wrote on political things, and Edward Said was highly inspired by his ideas. You see, impact of politics of knowledge. We have to define what is politics of knowledge. If politics of knowledge at that time revolved around the kingship, if it revolved around castles and that bureaucracy that ruled over the Muslim world, that unfortunately or fortunately still rules our world of knowledge. Knowledge became independent in the Muslim world only when they started writing about Islamic law and Islamic principles. And this divide, when it took place, then naturally we will see that many scholars were persecuted, or many of them who were willing to serve the political cause, they were employed by the rulers. We have an excellent example of Imam Abu Hanifa denying that privilege, but his student Shabani accepting that and becoming Chief Justice under the Abbasids. In the Umayyad period, they didn't bother about these things because there was hardly anybody who could oppose them. Those who tried, whether they were companions of the Prophet, children, or descendants of the Prophet, they were not spared. They were eliminated, tortured, or imprisoned, or bribed if they were willing to accept whatever the ruler was offering them. So, this period doesn't show that impact of politics of knowledge, it shows the impact of politics on everything. But when we started producing these, when we started opening these gateways of knowledge naturally, then politics came into existence. And politics, as I said, unfortunately, still rules the world. The curriculum, who decides curriculum, who decides what to teach in the schools. In one of my earlier lectures, somewhere I gave the example of two systems in the United States. One system that is followed mostly by all universities, not just state universities, but private universities, is the Chicago school system. They even select textbooks, which books to read, which books to avoid. Similarly, in Europe, we have two systems. One which is fashioned or designed by the French, the other by the Germans. Now, both are slightly different because the real, those people who are revolting against this establishment of knowledge, they say that the best work that was presented to us was by the left in Europe, starting from Karl Marx, mentioning Foucault, existentialists, all these people, that they contributed much more than what the establishment is producing or giving us. There was a difference in Germany because these Humboldt brothers, they did not allow politicians to enter into the universities and dictate their terms to the university syllabi or even appointment of professors. But religion had its sway. It's not written anywhere, but one of my colleagues, who is director of this institute, he told me that even now we cannot appoint any professor on chair of religion And religion means not just Christianity, any religion, unless we seek the approval of the Pope. There is a department in Vatican which gives approval. You are not obliged to, but you are supposed to do that. See, so yes, there the politics of religion comes, and the politics of knowledge, of course, comes from the state also. So I hope I have answered Dr. Tanveer and Jum's wonderfully phrased question.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, sir. Next, we will be moving to the question of Sajid Khan Gauri. He asked, what are the leading reasons why Islam remains in Africa and also many Arabic cultural traits, customs, rituals, social sanctions, and taboos in the medieval era of history? It's a supplementary question. Yeah.
It's a very good question and very relevant to what we are doing. You see,
Yeah.
Arabs came into contact with two powerful neighbors.
Sir.
One was on the east, the other was on the west. On the east was this Byzantinian. On the west was Iranian. Byzantinian had this amazing thing that they were Christians also. Iranians were not Christians. They were Parsis. This was one difference that we have to keep in mind. Secondly, Arabs, as I told you, gradually changed the language. They even changed the language of Iran. Now, if we start looking at the main actors in Hadith collection, in jurisprudence, I can name you a lot of people who were not Arabs. They were of Iranian origin, whether it was Imam Muslim, Bukhari, Majah, Tirmizi, Nasai, or Abu Hanifa, or Shafi, except for Imam Malik, or even Hanbal. Who were they? They were not Arabs. They were Arabized or Arabicized Iranians. Even in the domain of Sufism, we have most of the writings undertaken by these people who were originally from this part of the world. They were more educated in many ways, in philosophy, in other things. And if we read Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, we will come to know how much he puts the emphasis. He emphasizes, he goes to extent of saying that even if the Iranians would not have been approached by religion of the Prophet, they would have come to the same conclusion, to the same stage where those people who are guided by the religion, which is directly inspired by God Almighty. So this culture proved to be stronger. It has nothing to do, some people say that it has to do with Shia Sunni. No. Some of the best Sunni scholars, staunch Sunni scholars, came from this part, which is Iran today. When we look at some of the Mufassirin, Zamakhshari is considered one of the best. He was from this area. He was not from the Arab world. Now, what Iran learned from the Arabs was two things. One, they realized that their own ancient system of faith had something to do with Islam also. This is the only other language other than Arabic which has terms for most of the what we call Islamic features. I'll give you an example. For Nabi, for Rasul, the word Pagambar or Payambar. For Salat, Namaz. For Saum, Ruza. For Allah, Khuda. You name it, they already had all these words. Even for Jannat, they have Bahisht. Even for Jahannam, they have Duzakh. These are all original Persian words. So what the Arabs did was that they changed the script of their language. Old Iranian script was substituted by Arabic script. Many words from Arabic came into Persian. But if we make an imaginary line near Baghdad, dividing east and west of Baghdad, all the way up to the Philippines, will be dominated by that Islam that reached there through Persian language. And on the eastern side, Islam all the way up to Spain that reached there went through the Arabic script, Arabic language. So these two very important cultures, they determined and they dominated the Muslim world, and they are still doing it, though under different rubrics. But I wouldn't make this divide into sectarianism. It was simply a question of a civilization coming into contact with a new faith and feeling that their old faith, their old philosophy, their old customs had a lot of common things with this new religion. I think I have answered Gauri's question.
Hello. Is it audible, sir?
Now it's audible. Before it was not.
Sorry for inconvenience. Actually, this was due to certain technical problem.
I understand.
So, now we are heading to a question which is, I think, the most repeatedly asked question generally about the Muslim history, and particularly about this phase. This is a question of how to negate those claims which are always linked with Islam, that it was spread through the edge of sword. It wrenches my heart. Okay, so this is a question which is very repeatedly asked and raised about the Muslim history. So, what is your comment about that?
That's right. You see, if you remember one of our first sessions, in that I partly answered. Today I will answer it in a little more detail. You see, if we will call our history Islamic history, then you cannot avoid accepting this, that yes, how did we come to India? How did we go to Spain? How did we go to Africa? Did we go through the book or through our azans or through our prayers? No, we went on with soldiers, with horses, and with swords. So we have to clarify two things to ourselves and to those who say these things. Muslim empire, like all empires, was because of the sword and power. No doubt about that. Don't equate it with Islam. It was Muslim territorial area. Those areas which Muslim conquered, they conquered by force and by sword. Now, coming to the question of Islam, you see, it took more than 500 years for Islam to take roots in Iran. There's a beautiful book by Richard Bullitt, Conversions in Islam, in which he looked at the biographical dictionaries and pointed out that many people retained their religion in those areas. I mean, just imagine that 1400 years, if we look at the history, you can still trace Christian families in Syria, in Iraq, in Jordan, in Lebanon, even in Egypt. How did they survive? If Islam would have been spread by force, then they could have not been anywhere, these minorities. And add to that the fact that how many years Muslims ruled over in Spain, in India, in Europe, Turkish rule in Europe, Ottoman rule in Europe. But when they left, Muslims were in small minorities everywhere. In India, we have experienced that. We were a minority. In Spain, we were such a small minority that they asked Muslims to either leave the country, reconvert to Christianity, or face torture and death. Same thing happened with most of the East European countries. Very small Muslim minorities survive today, except for one country, which is a small piece of Albania, where you have about 65% Muslims. Or small enclaves like Bosnia Herzegovina and some other places. Otherwise, despite this centuries of rule in Europe and in Spain and in India, Muslims remained a minority. And this is not what sword does. And we should keep in mind that at that time there were no human charters, there was no United Nations, there was no question. Even Europe until the 16th century believed cuius regiu ius religiu. Whosoever controls the land, his religion will be supreme in that part. This is a European problem. It was never a Muslim problem. And I think it was Selim II, perhaps, the Ottoman ruler. He was so fed up with everyday rebellions by Christians that he asked his Chief Justice that, why don't we convert these people to Islam? And that Chief Justice said, sir, we cannot. The Quran forbids it. Quran says, La ikraha fid deen. This is recorded history. So Islam did not spread by sword, but Muslim empires did, like all other empires.
Sir, thank you very much, sir. We are getting another very pertinent question by Khalid.
Yes, I get the question. Both these are exaggerated notions. the Umayyads did not secularize the state. Their idea of religion was power. Their idea of faith was that whosoever comes into power is favored by God and hence has the license to do whatever they wanted to do. Secularism is when the state distinguishes between these two institutions. When the state says that your faith is your personal issue, we have nothing to do with it, and we will not interfere in it. That is secularism. Secularism is not something which, if you say that I have nothing to do with textual Islam, but use all those powers that you consider are given to you by God, then it's a power usurped by you in the name of religion. Now, on the contrary, the concept that you said of imamat, yes, imamat goes back to the idea, I'm sure you know the real meaning of the word imam in Arabic. Imam, actually, if you have seen that little tool of masons, that round thing which they put to make sure that the wall is going straight or not, that is called an imam. Similarly, like in the rosary, tasbih, which we use, the bigger bead is also called imam because it keeps these things together. So the imamat, the role of imam, according to the Quran, because Abraham is also called by God that I will appoint you imam also. Now here we must distinguish the function of these two institutions. Prophet brings the message of God to the people. Imam makes sure that people do it exactly as it was intended. Like an architect makes the design of a building, and that mason's tool makes sure that it stays within those limits in that straight line in which the architect wanted it to be. So the institution of imamat was not in that sense political in which it developed later on. It was simply to make sure that all those religious institutions, religious symbols that we use, they are kept in the same pure, unadulterated form in which the Prophet gave us. This is in many hadith books and in history books also, that after the allegiance was given to Ali ibn Abi Talib in Medina, it was in the mosque. So he led the prayers. And after the prayers, many of the people who had prayed behind him said, "Today we have remembered the Prophet's prayer." I have often talked about it. Did they mean spiritually it was as refreshing, as divine? No, even they meant visibly, physically, it looked like return of the Prophet's prayer. This is what Imam does. Imam brings back or shows this is the straight line. If you are making a building, it will waver and collapse. It won't be doing the same function that it was supposed to be. And that's why even in Sunni school, those scholars, those leaders who wrote about what real Islam is, they were also called Imam. So the Imam, the only thing is that according to Shia theology, Imam we cannot choose. Imam has to have a link with somewhere else, whether through inspiration or through designation by the Prophet. Whereas these people who were considered Imam, we have considered many people. Imamul Hind, if you look at the list, how many we see Mujaddid Alif Sani, we see Shah Waliullah, all these people, they were called Imam in the sense that they, in their own way, tried to put things right which they thought had gone wrong with the Muslim faith, with the Muslim practices, with the even main themes of Islam. So we have to distinguish these two institutions very clearly. It becomes political because of the persecution of that community which followed Ali. So then they preferred that, okay, it's better to have an Imam also as a political leader. Those followers of Ali did not pretend that during the period of the early caliphs. We should keep that in mind also. During the time of the first three caliphs, especially, there was a big group who supported Ali and Ali's cause, but they did not consider that this is the time for him. He approached them. He was consulted by them many times whenever they had any issue with certain things on which they needed his opinion, and he gave that opinion. So let's be clear on this thing that it has been politicized because of many reasons. And if Dr. Sajid Awan wants, we can have a session on that also. How does politics enter into this debate of our sectarianism? And what has happened to the institutions which were otherwise purely spiritual, legal, and juristic?
Sir, thank you very much, sir. We wish this program keep running, sir. However, there are a lot many questions people want to know about that. Out of so many questions, we will be picking few more, sir. Heading towards a question of Asad Bilal. Yes, as we see and mention the names of Muslim scientists and those invented
I don't hear anything. Yeah.
Yes, yes, sir.
Yes,
Uh,
I read the question, but I was
all
waiting
right,
for
sir.
you
All
to
right.
come
Yes, sir.
now.
Yes, please.
Um, this is not true that they were no sociologists, historians, or philosophers.
Yes,
If
sir.
we
Yes,
are not taught about them, that is not.
yes,
If you want, I can count as many as you like.
yes. Exactly.
I mean, in philosophy, the West still thinks that what Ibn Rushd contributed to philosophy, no one else has done that. What Ibn Sina contributed. Even Ghazali is criticized by some people, but if we look at Ghazali's work and compare it with Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, you will see amazing similarities between these two. So we have Mullah Sadra, my goodness, modern German philosophers think that he was one of the best philosophers that the Muslim world has produced. So you have a lot of Muslim philosophers. Uh, of course, they were not following those schools which we do see in the West. Secondly, in history, the revolution that Muslim historians brought, the West is still struggling with them. Have you read Masudi? Masudi's Murudi Zuhur? This was the first historian who thought that in order to understand a people, it's very important, first of all, to understand the culture in which they live, the climate that they have, the food that they eat, the professions that they have, This was later on developed by Ibn Khaldun, who is considered a marvelous sociologist, philosopher, historian, historiographer rather. Historian is not as good as he could have been. Al-Biruni gave us a methodology how to study another society, how to study another culture. So we do have a lot of people in social sciences also, those who contributed in their own way. And I think if we are not teaching them, we are not doing any service to our heritage. We should concentrate on teaching them, but not with the zeal that is religious, zeal that is scientific, zeal that brings you close to social philosophy, to social research. If we look at their work and see how they approach their subjects, then you will see that no, we do have big names in both these fields, both in history and philosophy.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Though, sir, we all are enjoying this discussion very much, but I will be moving towards the final question.
Yeah.
Am I clearly audible, sir? Yeah, right, sir. Finally, sir, how would you, sir, evaluate and conclude the contribution of this era contribution?
Contemporary
Contri-
period,
yes, sir. Umayyad period, sir.
Umayyad period. Umayyad period
Yes, sir.
contributed, you see, Umayyad period did one thing,
Sir.
and that was bringing a physical shape, I would say. You know, they had the biggest empire in the world.
Yes, sir.
If we look at the extent of Umayyad Empire, Europe, Africa, Asia, Mediterranean, you name it. And they had trade relations with other countries, they had embassies in other countries. So a culture developed during this period, which was dominated by the Arabs. They were Arab nationalists. And in fact, if you look at the beginning of Arab nationalism in the late 19th, early 20th century, you know, this revolt against the Ottomans, and then this Arab League, you will see their seeds in the Umayyad
Sir.
period. They were Arab nationalists first and foremost, and that's why they didn't give any damn to those non-Arab. And that's where, you know, this idea of difference between the Arabs and non-Arabs, it still hangs on, it still is on our minds. So that is one thing. Second thing is, as I told you, these alternates, you know, many people have written about it, but nobody have reflected over it. How did Jerusalem become so sacred for us? Why? Because Mecca was occupied by a person who wanted to defeat the Umayyads, Abdullah bin Zubair. While he occupied Mecca, the pilgrims who used to go from Umayyad domains to pilgrimage, they would come back and say that they have nothing good to say about you. So then Hisham decided, all right, no more pilgrimage. You will go for pilgrimage to Jerusalem, because this was our first Qibla, this was our first uh, major building to which Muslims used to face while saying their prayers. And for that, he built Dome of the Rock. And most of these people who built it, they were not Arab Masons. They were taken from Byzantine areas. And according to some people, that's a long story, that there was already a design on the ground, perhaps a monastery, an old monastery or something like that. And on that, this beautiful shape. This is a unique building, and many people say that perhaps the most unique and the most imposing building that Muslims have constructed. Similarly, this idea of palace living was fully borrowed, which later on was practiced, even it is practiced today by almost all Muslim rulers. Thirdly, we can count so many other things. This idea of keeping record. You see, at that time, you didn't have Xerox machines or you didn't have any copies. And who would know that if a ruler writes a letter to his governor and the governor changes it and does whatever he wants to do, and later on tells the ruler that this is the letter you gave me. In order to avoid that forgery, Umayyad started a system of keeping a copy of every ordinance that was sent out. Archives. They existed until the Abbasid period, and I think that's where we got the information when history was written or reconstructed by these people. They used this source material. So, this business of keeping a record, they had 6 divans as they were called, and all those divans, their records were very nicely kept. The idea of a standing army, it did not exist in the earlier time of Muslims, neither in the time of Khilafat Rashida, nor even before that. So Umayyads came up with this idea that let's stop the pension of all these people who were either companions of the Prophet or they were relatives of the Prophet. We pay regular salary to the soldiers, whether they were going to war or not. And the idea of male ghanimat or spoils of war, that's why these soldiers did not have any share of that. It was directly given to the ruler. So it became prerogative of the ruler to use it as they wanted. These were some of the many things that they introduced uh, in, uh, in the system of administration.
Sir, thank you very much, sir. Actually, I was personally more interested in knowing that when Umayyads went from here to Spain and they ran their governance there for a couple of centuries, and when they were kicked out there from, they went to Africa and they established Jamia Al Azhar, the biggest university in the Muslim world. But I think it requires another session.
Yeah,
I mean,
let me quickly say Jamiul Azhar was not developed by them, it was developed by the Fatimids. In Kairouan, yes, in Morocco, in Tunis, they were responsible for most of the replicas, I would call, of what they had
sir.
constructed in Spain. No, Spain deserves, if not more, at least 2 or 3 sessions. It was an amazing phase in our history, and it should be understood rather than praised. It should be understood. That's what I think my main aim is. Do we understand these periods of our history? We become emotional. Either we praise, oh my God, how did we achieve? What did we achieve at that time? And then it comes to what happened then after that. Then either we blame that these were conspiracies or we blame our fate. We become fatalistic. No. Just as rise has concrete reasons, similarly, falls also have concrete reasons. And they are always human reasons, and we have to understand them and analyze them.
Saturday. Sir, thank you very much for your very valuable thoughts. Next session, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.